I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network, chatting with writers and authors who offer an added perspective for our listeners. This is The Color Between the Lines. 1, 2, 3, 4. In this edition of The Color Between the Lines, we're speaking with award-winning journalist Travell Anderson. Anderson is the former director of culture and entertainment at Out magazine, as well as a film reporter with the Los Angeles Times. Tre'vel also co-hosts 2 podcasts and writes and reports for Essence, Teen Vogel, The Washington Post, Esquire, and Time magazine, and many more. And still, despite that very busy schedule, Tre'vel has managed to write a book entitled We See Each Other, a Black Trans Journey Through TV and Film. Thank you, Tre'vel, for joining us on the BIN.
Thanks so much for having me, Esther.
Well, in your book, you wrote about a lot of things. Influences growing up and influences on the screen. You said in your introduction, you pretty much felt like you learned to be homophobic from both influences. I wondered if you could just elaborate on that and how those influences kind of led you to where you are today as a writer.
Absolutely. Well, I feel like we all grew up in an era, right? Because all of our eras that we grew up in are different than the one we are in today, in which homophobia, transphobia was like baked into the cake, right? And so we all remember the jokes in our favorite TV shows about someone who was thought to be gay, right? But no one really talked about it. And so you just heard the jokes. Or I speak a lot in the book about my relationship to Medea, Tyler Perry's character of Medea. And in my adulthood, I have recognized how the same types of jokes that were made on screen about gay people, about trans people, about women who were played by men, right? And so there were always jokes about their quote unquote male features, right? How that has manifested in real life as the same violence that we as Black trans women in femmes experience in community. And so that's what I mean when I say that I was taught to be homophobic and transphobic, because we all were taught to be homophobic and transphobic. And like the goal and the work that we all should be doing, in my eyes, are to challenge and interrogate some of the things that we accepted as fact, right, when we were younger, that may not be reality, right, that may not have been informed by the truth of a variety of folks' experiences. And so that's what I mean when I say I was taught to be homophobic and transphobic. It's just that everything around me, from the images that I saw on screen to the jokes that my family members were making, to the ways that they tried to police how I was showing up in real life, it all taught me that the person who I knew that I was deep down inside since I was 4 years old didn't have the language when I was 4, but I knew I was quote unquote different. I knew that I was showing up in the world in ways that my mom and my dad and my pastor grandmother were saying that I shouldn't show up, right? And so they basically taught me to hate myself. And many of us have been taught to hate ourselves and spend a lifetime trying to undo that education.
Did that help you gain the strength to kind of push toward what your goal was, which was, I think, to become a really great writer and in this industry of the television and film industry?
I think a lot of it for me goes back to my time. I went to Morehouse for undergrad, and to be in that specific space, I'm talking to Black folks, so I know y'all know what I mean when I say that. To be in that specific space as someone whose gender identity was becoming so much in conflict with the stereotypical idea of what a Morehouse man is supposed to be, was interesting, to say the least. We always hear folks say, you can't be what you can't see. But for so many trans folks, we have created ourselves out of the depths of our imagination, not having a mirror in society to reflect something back to us. And I'm grateful that I have blossomed into this wonderful individual that is before you right now. But imagine who I could have been if my younger self was supported and affirmed. Imagine who I could have been. How much more of a wonderful, fabulous being could I have been if I didn't have to push up against all of the things that I had to push up against, right? And so much about my life today is an anomaly when you think about the life that I have lived and what I have been through. And through all of that, writing has been a motivator, right? Using my voice, my pen in that particular way has been a motivator, one, to tell my story, but also to tell the stories of other people like me who live, who love, and exist like me, both now, present day, but also those who came before us, because trans people are not new. We have existed since the beginning of time in every culture on this planet. And a lot of that history, many folks just don't know. They think we dropped onto the face of the earth with Laverne Cox on Orange is the New Black in 2014. But we've always been here. So it's important for me to remind folks that we've always been here.
Well, it's funny. You led me right to my next question in talking about the historical timeline of how trans lives are kind of portrayed in film and television.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain what you believe, I guess, were really key moments that needed to be addressed and why you wanted to highlight those in the book so people could understand the scope?
Yeah. Well, like I said, I have been a journalist for the last decade, and I've been covering diversity in Hollywood with focus on Black and queer film that entire time, right? This last decade has been wild when you consider where we started 10 years ago and where we are now in terms of just like the prevalence of trans people and conversations about trans people, not only on screen but also in culture writ large, right? And now we're seeing a certain type of backlash happening in state legislatures across the country towards trans people, trans women and girls specifically. And so because of that, I think that is why it feels like, we often hear people say that like we are, forcing transness down their throat. And that's because prior to Laverne Cox and the quote unquote transgender tipping point, you didn't see many of us on screen, right? And it led you to believe that you don't know any trans people. And the reality is we just have not created a culture, right, in which trans people feel comfortable letting you know that we are trans. And so we move through spaces. We go to the same churches as you all. We are your Starbucks barista. We are the person bagging your groceries at the grocery store. And you don't know that we're trans because we don't feel safe enough to tell you that we are trans, right? And so when we think about the history of the ways in which the community has been represented on screen, it's important for us to take a look at a film like Psycho or a film like Silence of the Lambs, right? In which you have these serial killer types, right? Who are dressing up as women, whose identities have been conflated with trans identities, that now lead us to today when we have state legislators, right? Assuming that we are serial killers, assuming that we are trying to prey upon, a variety of different folks. It's because they saw it on screen first, right? Because when you look at the reality, when you look at real life, trans people are just trying to use the bathroom. We're not trying to, we just trying to pee like everybody else. We're not trying to take up any space. We're not trying to do the things that they are trying to say that we're trying to do, but they've learned so much of that hatred in the same way that I learned so much of that hatred, right? From from the things we see on screen. And so it was important to talk about those moments, but then to also properly contextualize them while also talking about, in particular, the last decade or so where we are the most visible we've ever been, but also the most vulnerable, because visibility alone does not protect any community. It has not protected Black people, right? It has not protected women. It has not protected trans people either. And so much of our identities and our struggles for freedom are actually linked, but we don't often see them that way. And so one of the things that was important for me with the book, as I detail this history, is also to note the intersectionality, right, within. to reiterate that age old quote that we always say, that like your liberation is wrapped up in mine. You cannot be free until I am also free. Right. And so it requires self-interrogation for all of us, so that we get to that promised land we say we want.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how, you're talking about Black characters in television and how that they've changed. I mean, if you look at the Black characters in TV and TV and film in the 70s and 80s, that's a whole different, there's so many layers now of different Black characters in film and television. You can see so many different types of characters. Now, when you talk about the Black trans community, it's changing too. Watching Pose, I thought Pose kind of still fed into the whole stereotypical thing. Did you feel that when you watched it? Yeah, it gave people a look into the different layers of the Black trans experience. And made many people who just didn't see them, they saw them as other and not human. They gave them more of a humanity. But do you think that more of those characters are now going to change even more now? We're going to see a different range, do you think, in the next couple of years?
I hope so. I mean, the thing that you just did there with the show like Pose, which is like honor it for its boundary breaking, groundbreaking existence, because it was, right, for what it was showing us, but also being able to recognize some of the complexities therein, right? There is an age-old stereotype and trope of trans characters being sex workers, right? I used to love Law and Order SVU, right? And every single time there was a trans character on shows like that, right, they were sex workers. They were down and out. They were the victim, right? The nameless victim. And so with a show like Pose, in some ways, it does replicate some of those same stereotypes, right? By hyper focusing on, some of the members of the community who have had to engage in survival sex work in order to exist. The difference, though, was, right, you didn't have a man dressed up in a wig playing these trans women characters, right? The difference was you had actual trans women who have lived a similar type of experience as these characters, who can embody what we need them to embody on screen, but also continue the conversation off screen, right? And talk about the ways in which we need to push the industry and push these images forward. And so I think the goal is that we get to a point where we have as varied as possible images of trans people on screen, in the same ways that we're just, I would say, beginning to see a multiplicity of representation of different types of Black people on screen, right? Like, that is, I think, one of the spaces that we're trying to get to, and get to a point where, the trans narratives that you see aren't about our transitions. It's not about our tragedies and our struggles, but it's also about our humanity, right? And us living and loving just like the rest of everyone else. I think that is where we're trying to get to. And it's horrible to have to say that we need to humanize trans people, because we are already humans. But we are moving through a world, right, that has historically, and I would say still contemporarily, dehumanizes us over and over again. And so we have to use that language because we see the reality.
And I also gathered from this book that you really wanted to drive home the message of representation matters. It's not just in front of the camera, but behind the scenes. I know with Black folks, just in general, getting behind the scenes, and those who are in the chairs at the board, in the boardroom, you're not, we're still not there yet. In your experience in the industry, do you think it's getting better, or do you think that there is going to be some massive change that's going to have to happen in order to see more of a variety of different representation?
Yeah. It's interesting, because I'm always reticent to say, yes, progress is happening, because I think we get comfortable as an industry so easily. I think that's one of the reasons why we, as Black people, right, writ large, are still clamoring and struggling. And like, we're still having, when you look at the Hollywood industry, we're still having the first Black person nominated for this award, right? We're still having the second Black person nominated for this award. And like, that's wild when you consider the contributions that we as Black people have made to this industry, right? But the exact same circumstances there are what we're dealing with as Black trans people specifically, and trans people more broadly. Yes, representation matters. And it sounds kind of cliche to say, I know everybody's rolling their eyes, representation matters, but it does, right? Because it allows people to access so many possibilities of how we can move through the world, right? And when the only representation you have is something that is stereotypical, with something that is written in tropes, which Black folks know all too well, how that begins to turn into policy. How that begins to turn into, these other ways, right, that folks attempt to constrain us and limit us, and tell us who we should be, instead of allowing us to tell them who we are. And so, yes, things are changing, not fast enough for my own personal liking. And I would also say that there needs to be a huge shift made, because when you look at the people at the tippy top of, these studios who are making the green light decisions for all content that we see, it's still the same people, same type of people in many ways. And then also this actual same individuals who have had the jobs for 15, 20 plus years, right? And, I don't like to tell people that they need to, lose their job, because we all got bills to pay. But when the same people are in the executive suite, right, who were there 15 years ago, 20 years ago, or the same mindset at minimum is in that suite, we will never get to a place where Black people have a variety of images of ourselves on screen in the ways that represent the complexity of our actual lived experience. We always say Black people are not a monolith, but you would not necessarily know that when you turn on the TV screen sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's the same way with trans people. We are not a monolith, but you would not know that based on a lot of the images we see on screen. So there's just so much more work to be done, and we've got to come at it from every which way possible to see that progress that really will be lasting.
Well, you have been a wonderful conversation here. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Travell Anderson, for joining us on the BIN.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, the book is We See Each Other, a Black trans journey through TV and film. That's it for this edition of The Color Between the Lines. I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network.